But it
kind
was
of like the N-word,
medically
right?
used,
Kind
right?
of like the N-word, right? Like there's a certain
Well, not
historical
kind of like the N-word.
context.
Wasn't hermaphrodite a medical term?
Welcome to another installment of There Are Only Two Genders, Change My Mind. Unedited conversations with people on the street. Usually we do this on campus, but during summer break, that's kind of hard to do. So before we start, because this is a long one, I wanted to show you how this conversation ends up with our second person who claimed to be intersex and got a little hostile. And the reason for this is because of the length of these conversations. If you ever feel like we're talking around in circles or getting off in the details, you'll see that they come back later on and they matter. That's key when having a conversation and finding common ground. So this is about the end point.
Well, no.
Two ends
The
of a
biological
spectrum of
makeup
types
of a brain
brains.
is not societal. The biological makeup of a
No,
brain
you're
is
right,
biological.
but what I'm saying is
so
the
I want
brain,
to make
right. So what I'm saying, the brain that you call the male brain or the female brain with what you're
you
saying.
did, not me.
I'm saying is closer to that brain that you are referring to as a male brain.
You referred to it that way. So I want to make sure I'm correct that you believe there is a male brain generally and a female brain
I'm not going to say yes to
generally.
you when I'm explaining my answer, when I'm giving you my answer.
Okay.
My answer is what you are referring to as a male brain is more...
But I didn't. You did. That's why it's important. You brought this up, male brain and female brain. I'm trying to understand what you brought up. I didn't bring up male brain, female
that
brain.
So that context matters because we are going to rewind all the way to the beginning, where you can see that intersex girl works for this person who approached me, transgender male to female Danielle Skidmore, actually running for Austin City Council in District 9.
How are you? Would you like to change my mind?
I'll try.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
So I was going to the post office and saw your table, and I've heard about your show, so I thought...
Oh, great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, right?
Appreciate
So,
it.
cool.
What's your name?
Danielle.
Danielle. Absolutely. So, Stephen, and if you're familiar at all with the show, this is just where we engage in a civil discussion, dialogue on issues that are usually pretty controversial. They result in talking points with a lot of people, and you don't get to see full-length conversations. So, I believe there are two genders.
Okay.
You're welcome to change my mind.
I think human biology is really complicated. I think that gender identity is real and intrinsic, and I don't think there's a binary.
Sorry.
I don't think there's a binary for anything.
Can I ask you, are you transgender?
I am actually.
Okay.
I'm sweaty this morning.
That's okay. No,
And it's funny. I was walking down the street and I was like, "Oh my gosh, this is a sign, right, to have this conversation."
So, what do you believe is wrong, I guess, about my state? You said
there's two genders?
Yeah.
I think I've come to realize, so I'm trans, right?
Yeah.
And that why we are the way we are, like what makes our core humanity, right, is beautifully complicated. So like my son's got a genetic disorder, right? He's missing an enzyme that lets him metabolize 2 amino acids, right? Why that is, you have no idea. Like it was a biological variation, it's true, right? It doesn't diminish his humanity,
right?
But it is fundamentally different. Now, like why I'm trans, to be honest with you, I don't know, right? Now it took me 37 years to stop fighting what I knew to be true from the earliest ages, like as a child, to work my way through the social stigma of my reality, which was that I know I'm different. I don't understand why I am. I don't know why I would, go and hide in the bathroom and wear my sister's clothes, right? Like when I was 7, right? Like, yet it all got wrapped into the expectations of society.
Okay, so I want to make sure I'm just kind of unwrapping this carefully. You said the truth of your reality, that you are a woman.
A transgender woman. Yeah.
Okay. How do you know that's the truth?
How do I know that it's true?
Yeah.
How do you know that you're a heterosexual, I presume, heterosexual cisgender man?
Okay.
It's presumptuous of me, right?
No, well, that's okay. That was presumptuous, but correct.
Okay.
Well, I think this is obviously a big component of the LGBTQAI community that preferences, sexuality preferences. As far as I'm attracted to women, that's a preference, obviously. So it's innate. I was born, I like women, and biologically I was born a male because I have a penis and the hormonal profile and chromosomes of a male. So that's how I know that it's true to state that I'm a male.
That you're the male because you're a male because like you're XY.
I didn't simplify it to XY, a multitude of factors. I have a male brain. I have a male body. Everything from bone density to my hormonal profile to, yes, my penis. All of these things pretty clearly would file me in the cabinet under male, biologically.
Like in the spectrum of biological variation, you're in that big collection of people that have all of those things in alignment.
Yeah.
There
exactly,
are people, right, like 2/3 of 1% is the best number now, right? That are transgender, based on what we know.
Sure.
Which in Texas is like 130,000 adults, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who, for reasons that are still unknown, don't have all of those biological components that you described, don't align as cleanly as yours do.
Okay. Well, you say, unknown. Again, this goes back to you said your truth that you are a female.
Yeah.
You asked me, why am I a male? I hope that I've answered it as clearly as I can.
Right.
So I would return that same question to you because I think we need to start with the presupposition. There needs to be the same amount of validity to our arguments as far as us rationalizing them. You said the truth that you are a female.
Yeah.
You were born a male. How do you know that's the truth?
I was born a transgender woman.
Okay, and how do you know that's the truth?
How do I know that's the truth? Like, in what biological context? Is it validated? Is that the question?
Yeah, how do you know that you're not simply a man who believes he's a woman?
How do you, why are you, if you're heterosexual, why are you attracted to women?
Well, there's a lot of biological mechanisms in there, namely to procreate since the beginning of civilization.
If somebody is attracted, same-sex attracted, a gay man, do you believe that that's not their intrinsic reality?
Well, again, it's a sexual preference. And I think that's very important because a sexual preference is different from biology, right? And this is what I find also pretty interesting to me is right now they're teaching that, obviously you're born gay, but gender is a choice. And that to me, I just don't agree with. So, how do you know? You say that you're a transgender, you were born a transgender woman, right? Yeah. But I would assume on your birth certificate it said male.
Right.
So at some point you made the decision to live the way that you live right now, correct?
At some point I made the decision, it was almost a decade ago, to unpack all of the guilt and shame I felt for being different, right? And at some point I made the decision to unpeel guilt and shame, right, about my truth, and to start trying to reconcile it with the rest of my life, and to reconcile it with a society that is still pretty hostile to people who are different. Mm-hmm. So it was a question of no longer fighting against myself.
Yeah.
So, and then even after I did that, I spent another 6 years desperately trying to not accept that. I accepted the truth, and I'm like, how do I reconcile with that? I'm an engineer, a civil engineer. I'm a parent, a special needs child, right? Like, how can I be who I knew I am and still function in society? So it took me years, and eventually I realized that I don't have a choice. Like, we look at the news this morning, right? And with Tony Bourdain, taking his life, right?
Right.
So 40% of transgender people attempt suicide.
Can I pause you right there really quickly? Just first off, I hope that I haven't been hostile. I know you talked about
haven't been hostile
at
all. No, this is a great...
Okay, good.
Good.
Because I know we disagree, but I certainly don't want to be disrespectful to you personally, even if I disagree with you.
I don't find that we disagree, actually.
Okay. Well, I'm glad that way, because the last thing I want is for you to feel as though you've been sat down and it's been a sandbagging. And you've brought up, Anthony Bourdain, you brought up the suicide rate. I think that's very important. It's about 41%. It doesn't get better after hormone replacement therapy, or even actually doing the
Okay.
full sex reassignment surgery.
So here we are, right? I will disagree with you.
Okay.
I think the data shows that when people are able to live their lives as themselves and are accepted in their community, in their social networks, that's their friends and their family, professionally, in their city, when they're not stigmatized, when they don't lose their job, when they don't lose their housing, when they aren't ostracized or demonized, right? Like our state legislature spent the last spring and then called a special session essentially to demonize my existence based on somebody's, I don't honestly, sincerely held religious belief. I'm not sure why, but to basically challenge my very validity as a human being, right? Then, yeah, people can be frustrated and scared and terrified and hopeless and then kill themselves. But in my community, when people are able to live their lives and are accepted and able to, aren't discriminated, right? Then their suicide rates fall dramatically. The single best thing you can do for somebody who's LGBTQ of any sort, but especially trans, is recognize their truth and accept their humanity.
Well, I would disagree with you there. And first off, I think you made a couple. Yeah, and let me explain why. You made a couple of presumptions. Maybe they're not trying to demonize your very existence. Maybe they just disagree with you, and maybe it doesn't come from a Christian perspective. Maybe it comes from a scientific one. Maybe it comes from a perspective of a medical perspective. For example, at Johns Hopkins.
No, that's okay.
I think we're okay having a conversation, you and I, right now, right?
Yeah, we're good.
We're good. Thank you, though. And the suicide rate statistically, anecdotally, I'm glad to hear that your group of friends do better. Because one thing, I definitely don't want people attempting suicide in a 41%.
It's not just my friends. I mean, the data from the National Center for Trans Equality, the Equality Texas, HRC, it's not like my anecdotal sort of group of friends. The scientific data shows that when people are not discriminated against and when transgender individuals are able to live their life, whether they, just transition socially or have hormone replacement therapy or have surgery, whatever, when people are able to live their lives, their mental health is better.
Well, statistically, it's inaccurate. Statistically, the suicide rate doesn't really improve after
I'm
sex
keep
reassignment
back
therapy.
on
But
that, so maybe that's something we can follow up on.
Okay, let's assume it's comparable. Let's assume it's slightly lower. Let's go with that. I've seen the studies that you're talking about, and it might be slightly lower. It's not dramatically lower. But I think this is predicated on the idea, and I don't think it's an ill-founded idea, that because of discrimination, because of societal pressure, because of feeling like an outsider, people have more mental health issues. People are more prone to depression. People are more likely to attempt suicide if they feel ostracized and isolated, right?
Yeah, if they're treated as less than human.
I would agree. But the fact is, minorities generally commit suicide or attempt it in far fewer numbers. For example, white males are 2 times more likely than black men. The transgender attempted suicide rate is higher than American slaves or Jews in concentration camps. Are we to believe that they've been treated more poorly in modern America than American slaves or Jews in Auschwitz?
You're asking me to compare transgender individuals to
the statistical reality that nowhere else do you find that suicide rate outside of some serious psychiatric disorders, including those who have been enslaved. Which might suggest again that this is not a truth, as you said. People may perceive it as a reality, but it may not be ideal to treat it just telling people that that's the truth, that's the reality, when it's in conflict with biology and their hormones and their brain and their biological makeup, because it can have catastrophic results. And how many genders are there? Because now we're talking about non-binary, right?
How many genders are there? I think gender is a continuum. I think part of this is my take on it, right? And this is my own personal opinion and how I've come.
How do you identify, just so I make sure?
Do
you just identify as a woman?
I'm a transgender woman. Yeah,
so you say transgender woman?
I'm comfortable owning the fact that I'm trans. I don't know that any of us has a responsibility to own anything about our own individuality. Like, I don't think anybody needs to walk down the street and say, "Hi, I am a heterosexual man," or "I am a homosexual woman," right? But for me, I'm comfortable being visible, right?
Sure.
I'm lucky that I get to live in Austin and I get to be visible and not suffer too many consequences. Mm-hmm. Now, the reality is I am a very small sliver of the trans population.
Right.
I weren't white and professional, right? My murder rate, if I were an African American transgender woman, I'd be 30 times more likely to be murdered than
Yeah.
I am. So
African American men are much more likely to be murdered than white men too. So a big part of that is
right,
not
I mean,
necessarily
race
trans.
is real, right? And that's another
by other
huge
black
issue.
people too.
Race is a component of all of our interactions in society.
I
But
think it's
okay,
important
so back to
not-
my truth, right?
Yeah.
So like our gender identity, who we are in our brain from birth, before we're talking about any kind of hormonal replacement, okay?
Yeah.
Is varies across all of us. I'm at peace with. And I honestly think the science will prove that fact. There was a study that was presented this summer in, I forget the researchers, I think were Belgian or Dutch, and it was presented in Spain, Barcelona, like a month ago, that doing imagery studying, right? So
Sure.
functional MRIs on brains of transgender children before HRT, okay? So this is, there have been some studies that have done in
The
the
most
past
famous
that
study was the Rometty study.
was done with folks who might have been in transition or post-transition.
Yeah.
And this study has been of children who identify, at a young age, pre-puberty, many, before any kind of medical intervention. And the studies are showing changes in differences in brain structure that are independent of whether somebody is sort of estrogen dominated or testosterone dominated.
Could you describe brain changes? What do you mean by that?
You mean what the studies were showing?
Yeah.
I don't know because I haven't actually read the the paper itself. I read the abstract for the information.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding, because we just jumped around a bit. I just want to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying.
Yeah.
So you're saying there's a more recent study
Yes.
that showed children pre-transition, let's say a boy who identified as a girl actually had brain differentiations from the standard male brain.
Yeah, so
deviations.
a transgender girl, right? Her brain has structures that they're observing with imagery now that are more consistent with cisgender girl, okay, than they are with a cisgender boy.
Okay.
Regardless of chromosomes, regardless of external genitalia.
I haven't read this recent study. I'm very familiar with the Rometty study,
Yeah.
and then the more comprehensive
fascinating.
study afterward, which said that the changes only occur after hormones are administered. But it is interesting that you bring that up. So that would presuppose then that there is a male brain and a female brain,
Yeah,
right?
I think there is a male brain and a female brain.
Okay. So then that would sort of
I
that would
was
have
born
to
with a
dispel
female
the
brain.
idea that gender is a social expression, because you said it's a spectrum. But if there is a male and a female
yeah,
brain,
so that's a good point, right?
then
I think
how can
that-
someone
I think
be
that-
born with a male brain as a female?
As humans, I think our gender identity, okay, is real and intrinsic and based in biology. Like
Okay.
that's something that took me 4 decades to work through.
Sure.
Because of everything else socially around us, the pressures for conformality, conforming, and because, quite honestly, being trans isn't easy.
Oh, I
You
can't
know what
imagine.
I'm
Yeah.
saying, right? So, and all of my friends, everybody that I, like, when I finally came out and started coming out, and I have built a huge trans community, my circle of trans friends, almost universally, like when we talk to each other, we all have the same lived experiences, that we knew this from a very early age. And what we struggle with is how do we reconcile that with the rest of society? So yes, I think gender is real and intrinsic.
So you do believe there's a male brain and a female
I
brain?
think that all of our brains very beautifully so, and I think that there are brains that are
Hold on a
primarily
second.
male or
Okay.
female. I think there are brains, when we talk about somebody who might be gender non-binary, who are somewhere in between. They are. I don't think that there's a binary for anything. But your point about the
So how many genders are there?
How many genders are there?
Because you talked about demonizing people, and I don't want to demonize anybody. I don't want.
Noise.
Sorry, yeah, it gets a little noisy. The last guy was going out with a Harley.
Yeah, it's Rat Rally this weekend.
Oh, is it? Okay. So, what was I talking about? Sorry, before that truck went by.
About the idea of how many genders.
I don't want to demonize anybody.
Yeah,
And of course, when
right.
you're looking at state laws that misgendering could be considered some form of assault, or misgendering could be hate speech, it's important, if you're presenting this argument as your truth.
Somebody proposing legislation that
Yeah, it exists in Canada already. misgendering is already a crime, and it's been proposed here in the United States. And so it's very important that if we do that,
let me just clarify. Okay, because I spent a lot of time at the Capitol last year, and I don't know. I hope I don't have to spend a lot of time next year at the Capitol, but I sense
not all of us feel the same way.
I know, right? Let's argue about other things.
It's not exactly a party,
but I don't see. I haven't seen anybody proposing that somebody using the wrong pronouns for example.
Oh yeah, it happens all over the place. For example, in New York, if you're a landlord and you do it, you can be sued. And in Canada, Jordan Peterson is someone I would really look up where I was
raised. So this is an example where I'm not going to argue or disagree with you because I don't without the.
So you wouldn't want any kind of laws like that, the misgender. You wouldn't want any pronoun laws or anything like that. Then
pronoun laws? No, I mean I think that our community, right? I think that we should have protection, non-discrimination protection that's afforded to.
Well, then it has to be defined like any other protected group. So it's important. I mean, you've talked about your truth and you living within society.
Yeah.
I think the issue with people who disagree with it, first off, the biological basis. Obviously, the suicide rate, there are a lot of concerns. But also, right now, we're restructuring all of society, Western society, to accommodate less than 1% of the population.
How are we restructuring?
And if we're going to, if I may just finish.
Yeah, please.
If we're going to do that, I think it's important for me to know if I need to use the right pronouns and not be accused of demonizing someone, even accidentally. How many pronouns are there? How many genders are there?
Okay, well let me push back. Okay, I think if you use the wrong pronoun, right?
Mm-hmm.
If I said, that if I use she, her for you, right?
Sure.
And made a mistake, right? That's a mistake, right? And if somebody,
I think it would be a deliberate insult. You're not making. This wouldn't be a mistake. You looked at me and assumed, as you said, male, heterosexual, and that's fine. I have no problem.
At this point, if I chose to use she, but if I'm talking and I say, she instead of he, or make like just that, right? Get it wrong, and then somebody says, hey, it's she, right? It's a term. It would be respectful, right?
What if someone says Z? What if someone has a different gender that's not in the binary and wants a new pronoun? And what if I won't be compelled to use their language?
Right? So languages.
How many genders are there?
How many genders?
How many pronouns are there? What do we do with people who don't use the proper pronouns?
I think we treat everybody with respect, right? So if you came to me and said, I would prefer that you use they, them, right? Because I'm non-binary, or Z0, okay? Which is like...
a new term, yeah.
Which is actually an old term. Z0 is older than they, them, right? And linguists will debate, which is more linguistically correct. And I think that language is an attempt to describe our society. So if you asked me to use they, them, I would work to use they, them because I want to respect you, right? But now, if I inadvertently said he, right, instead, I wouldn't consider that hate speech, right?
Well, for example, I asked you if you were transgender when you sat down.
Yeah.
I've asked people that who were transgender, and they were immediately very offended.
Yeah.
But again, I have to know so that I don't misgender you, so that I don't get into trouble. This is a society we created. It divides us more than it unites us. And I tried to ask you in a respectful way with that, but
I don't think it divides us.
Well, you should have seen this lady in Ann Arbor. She wasn't happy about it.
She wasn't happy that you asked?
Yeah, transgender.
Well, I think it's a very personal question, right? And
I don't think it's very... If we go back to how many genders are there, how many pronouns are there, if we're going to restructure society, I think we need to know.
Yeah, but let's go back to why does my gender identity, in normal moving about society, right?
Yeah.
Why does whether I'm trans or not matter to you?
Yeah, well, because it's a central building block for society, the American family. We see statistically that children do better with a mother and a father in the household. It's the biggest determining factor.
All right.
It's the biggest determining factor in poverty, crime, whether they go on to college, whether they end up in prison, whether they have a family of their own, happiness, mental illness. Mom and dad, and his dad specifically, still in the household. I mean, we talk about these social programs, welfare, we talk about improving education. If we could have more families with a mother and a father with the children, there would be nothing that could affect the productivity and the outcome for children. Yeah.
Am I a lesser parent to my son because I'm trans?
I believe that all children, blanket statement, do better with a mother and a father in the household.
What about that family arrangement is intrinsically better than a mother and another mother, or two fathers, or
it's a fair
mother
question.
And a transgender mother?
It's a fair question. I
so
believe that.
What about it is better, other than it's not the majority?
Right.
But how is that intrinsically better?
Right. the statistics would reflect that as far as productivity and outcomes with children is because, and in my, so that these are the statistics. My opinion, and again, you have a lot of sociologists and scientists who look at this. I think it's pretty straightforward. I don't believe that two mothers can provide everything that a mother and a father can provide a child, and I don't believe that two fathers can provide everything that a mother and a father can provide a child. I don't believe men and women are interchangeable, and I think that's the core issue right now.
Okay,
when we say gender's non-binary, that's a spectrum, and we haven't gotten definitive answers on any of this. We're saying that gender is
definitive answers. That's the.
I think we do. I think we do.
Yeah, I don't know that we do. I don't like in my life when I'm moving about the world, right?
Yeah.
When I'm practicing as an engineer, taking care of my son, like what do my chromosomes look like is not. It has nothing to do with how I'm able to interact in society and how I'm able to take care of him. And
I think it has a lot to do with it.
I'll tell you my lived experience is that I am just as capable of taking care of my son now as I was before, and in many ways better, because I'm no longer fighting with the crushing burden of knowing something to be true, right? And not being able to live it. So then when you talk about people in a family that is a mother and a father being somehow healthier for children, I come back to so much of the health in our families and in our lives has to do with everything else in our social stigma that we're living with. So yeah, something, my reality now as living in the world.
You keep saying my reality, my truth.
My truth.
What's the reality? The truth, I think, is what matters to find common ground. What's the truth?
My truth is the truth for me. It's that simple.
That's just another way of saying my truth. What's the truth? Biologically, what's the truth scientifically?
The truth biologically is all creatures are phenomenally complicated.
Sure.
And the truth biologically is different for every one of us. Peter's truth biologically is different, but it doesn't make him any less human.
No, it doesn't make him any less human.
So there's no truth. There's
just like an 8-week-old fetus is no less human than a baby, and that's why I'm pro-life. This is human DNA. This is a genetic code that determines your.
So then the idea.
No, I don't think that anyone is less human. Just like I don't think so. Listen, I have family members who are bipolar.
Right, but
I've had suicides in the family with people.
What you keep saying is that my truth is
I'm not really able to say a whole lot. I haven't really gotten many words in. I haven't really been able to express my opinion, but I'd continue.
Well, I wanted and then.
I think
my truth and the truth is the question I'm trying to figure out.
Yes.
Is that what I hear from you when you keep saying what is the truth is that there is one singular answer for what it means to be human, or what it means to be male, or what it means to be female.
We're specifically discussing gender.
For gender. And what I'm saying is there's not. There isn't. There's never been. Through history, there's never been. When you look at literature all the way back into the Bible, it reflects, the historical record reflects that our biology, our humanity has always been beautifully complicated. So it's not, this is not...
I don't disagree with that statement, but I do disagree with the idea that gender is a spectrum and that there's a limitless amount. I just disagree with that.
Yeah, I know there's lots of people.
I know
you do, right?
What was your name again?
Danielle.
Danielle, thank you, Danielle. I appreciate you taking the time.
Too, it's good.
I hope this has been productive for you as well as myself. I really do appreciate you sitting down and we're having a civil dialogue, even if we disagree. Listen, honesty above civility, but I think you should have both.
Can I make a request?
Yes.
Actually, is that imagine a world where people were debating whether you were as legitimate in your humanity as you.
I'm not debating that you're legitimate in your humanity.
I know,
Just as I'm not debating that my relative who's bipolar is legitimate in humanity.
But I'm saying, imagine a world where you are.
Yeah, but I'm not.
I'm not suggesting you. I'm talking about our society right now.
I think you're misconstruing. I think if someone says there's two genders, you think that's demonization.
No, I
think
didn't
that's
say demonizing. I'm asking you to have to go into your headspace.
Sure.
Imagine navigating a world where people come up and actually challenge your legitimacy.
Yeah, which I've done.
My truth,
right,
the truth.
Which I've done. I'll grant you that. I've done.
Yeah, and imagine living in that space where strangers can debate whether or not you are as legitimate.
Yeah.
That's all I ask.
It's not about legitimate. It's about the truth. They're debating as to whether or not it's the truth.
legitimacy and the truth. So what's the difference between those?
Yeah, there's a big difference when it's your truth or my truth, and we're talking about legitimacy. Legitimacy would be much more congruent with the truth.
And
so
I'm
if someone
saying
says
that the
gender
truth
is not a spectrum,
Yeah.
if someone says there are two genders, and that the biological research would back this up, and that I don't think it's productive to continue down this trail, certainly of a limitless gender spectrum, that's not questioning your legitimacy as a human. That is questioning the nature of the condition, the nature of how you identify and why that is the case, and the ramifications societally.
So then you're implying that there's something wrong with me.
I'm implying that I believe you're incorrect. I believe you were born a male, and I still would believe that you're a male. Yeah, I won't misgender you.
So
I don't
imagine
be rude.
a world where people could tell you that you're incorrect.
That happens all the time. Yeah, it's not a good feeling, but this is an issue. No, I appreciate it, Danielle. Thank you very much. I think a friend here would like to get in. Thank you very much. I appreciate you taking the time.
Now enters previously mentioned Danielle's intersex employee. You'll note a little different tone.
This is I have a long line of ginger genetics. What's your name?
Alicia.
Alicia. Thank you, Alicia. I noticed you were there for a long while with your
Yeah,
video
that's my
camera.
boss, actually. I heard that y'all were doing this.
Who's your boss?
Danielle, who you were just
Oh,
speaking
Danielle,
with.
nice.
Yeah.
Alicia?
Yeah, my name is Alicia.
Alicia, nice to meet you, Alicia.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
And it's funny, I heard that y'all were doing this, and I texted her, and I was like, I'm on my way. She's like, oh, girl, I'm already there. I was like, okay.
Okay.
So yeah.
It's kind of a double team action.
Not in, like on purpose, but just kind of accidentally. And
That's
that was
fine.
a weird phrasing of that, too. But anyway.
How so?
Well, so I actually wanted to talk about the biological aspect that you were referring to.
Well, let me present my premise first,
Sure.
because it's important that
Of course.
people, anyone who's here who wasn't here for the previous conversation, this is designed to be a discussion that hopefully opens a civil dialogue. I believe in searching for the truth. My presupposition is that there are two genders, and if you would like to change my mind on that, you're more than welcome.
Sure. Well, so I heard my boss talking a lot about a spectrum, not just in terms of like gender identity, but also in terms of really any biological trait, right? That humans exist on a spectrum, whether it's a racial spectrum, like there are people that are half something or whatever, biologically we're all on a spectrum. Some men can grow facial hair and some can't. Like some of it's defined by your chromosomes, some of it's defined by hormone levels, some of it's defined, I think you would not refute that we all exist biologically on a spectrum in terms of our phenotypes, right? And how we...
There are certainly differentiations between people. For example, you can have a multitude of men. Some are tall, some are short, some are fat, some are thin, some have red hair, brown hair. Yeah,
so
but they're all men. Yeah.
It's nice when we can agree on something.
Yeah.
Well, so in terms of that spectrum, and where I hope that my existence can shed some light for you, I was actually born intersex, which means that you would never know this, and no one who's ever been with me sexually would ever know this either, but I was actually born with XY chromosomes, and so instead of having a uterus and ovaries, I had internal testes that were then removed from me by doctors who come from kind of your perspective and some similar perspectives that we need to normalize people to fit these society-driven standards of what a human is or should look like. But so for me, my question for you is, if I irrefutably was born intersex, I can...
That's okay. You don't. I'll just
I
go.
don't need to get my birth certificate.
No.
Yeah. Thank you. That was another thing. This whole birther thing, right? It's proving
birther.
Basic truth. Yeah, the whole birther movement, right? Needing to show our birth certificates to prove our legitimacy as humans. I'm thinking back to Trump and Obama and everything. Anyway, that's not where I was.
Yeah, unrelated.
Unrelated.
That was silly.
So if it is irrefutably true that I was born intersex and that actually almost 2% of the world's population, so 150 million individuals worldwide, were born intersex and then normalized through surgeries or otherwise, if we are born somewhere in between in terms of our biological traits, then how can it not also be true that we might identify somewhere in between in terms of our gender and how that presents itself?
Okay.
Certain people are born, for example, with breasts and a penis, or they might have ambiguous genitalia, or me, I was born with I hate that I have to sit here at a table with you talking about my genitalia. I don't believe any human should ever have to do that.
You don't have to.
Well,
you
the reason that
down.
The reason I am is because there are people like you and that are, I was about to say with respect, but that don't respect basic biology, people's identities, and that was kind of my biggest argument against the bathroom bill when I was arguing with Lois Kolkhorst, is if you want to pass a discriminatory piece of legislation, at least open a bio textbook first. It's not hard.
Right.
These are just like basic science.
Okay. So a couple of things there. First off, I hope you don't feel as though I forced you to sit down here in any way.
No, you
were
didn't force me, but
right.
the conversation and the existence of it, that's what forces me, because there are people who like are so fed up with having to legitimize their existence on a daily basis.
Sure.
When you don't have to do that, right? Like you were born in a way where like no one is challenging that, and that's something that I heard my boss talking about too.
It's actually not true. But we don't need to get into my personal history.
Okay.
So you mentioned a couple of things there. I want to
Is there
sort
any
of.
water for that?
There isn't. We used to until we realized that it was a legal liability. If maybe Danielle can get you a bottle of water, because the last thing you want is someone saying that I poisoned you.
No,
I would
it's
never
okay.
do that.
Yeah.
I'm sure you can understand. So you mentioned basic biology textbook, and then you immediately followed up with how someone identifies.
Yeah.
I think they're two separate issues. Now I understand that you're intersex. We've talked about this with several.
Right. So then, what do
Can
you
I-
think in relation to that?
Yeah.
And
So
the
we've
gender
talked about
spectrum?
intersex. So another thing I would strongly disagree with. Statistically, you said 2% of the population are intersex.
I said almost 2. I believe it's 1.7.
Yeah, I
but
believe
there's
it's
a large,
significantly lower than that,
It's
particularly
not,
in
but
the Western
there's actually
civilization,
there's
much
actually a large-
lower.
There's actually a dearth of data, though, as well, because what happens is doctors will play God and make a decision about what biological sex a child should have, and so they perform a surgery. And sometimes the
Yeah.
parents aren't even made aware, or like with foster children, right? Like the state makes these decisions. So like,
So you would believe it's
again,
higher
like,
than 2%?
I don't have a printout of like a bio textbook with me, but I don't want to argue with you.
You
over,
referenced a biological
over,
textbook.
like irrefutable truths, right? We can talk about your opinion, right? But like, I
Sure.
don't want to argue with you about science.
Sure.
really.
Well, you haven't stated any irrefutable truth. So let's get to what the truth is.
Okay.
So you believe it's higher than 2%?
I said
Intersex.
1.7, and that's
But you
all
said
on
because
record.
doctors play God, the number's likely higher.
Oh yeah, right, exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
and because this is also like when data started being collected, right? Like,
Sure.
is after a lot of these decisions have been made. There are people that aren't told by their parents or by doctors and don't even know until maybe they don't get their period, or something like that.
Sure.
That like helps them realize
Yeah.
that they've been born different.
Right. So I want to do you believe it's higher than 2%, or you believe the statistic you've used is accurate? Because you just said biological truth. I want to make sure.
The statistic that I cited is as accurate as the information that we have available right now.
Okay.
But that information, as I just mentioned, is not necessarily fully comprehensive.
Sure, so you believe it
because
could be
of
higher. I wanna make it
decisions that
sure.
are made by doctors.
Okay, I would say the statistic is significantly
hope I'm
lower
speaking
from
for
the
you.
literature that I've read. But again, let's remove intersex from the table, because when we're talking about transgender, we're not generally talking about
Okay.
intersex. So intersex
But
Klinefelders,
but that
there are
was my
genetic
question.
anomalies.
But that was my question.
Yeah,
was,
well, let me answer-
if
can I answer
someone's
your
in
question?
between, then why would their gender? So biologically, they're
Am
born in
I
between.
going to be allowed to answer at any point
Well,
here?
but let me just clarify my question, because you
Okay.
said I'm talking about intersex and you're talking about transgender. But for me, this is related, because if people are born in between, like in terms of physical manifestation, right?
Sure.
So then why should they have to choose I'm a male or a female if they were not born a male or a female? Like, yeah, that's my question for
Okay,
you.
so I'm going to go back to answering your question.
Yeah.
All of this was very imperative in answering your question, because you said biological realities, people need to read a textbook, and then you mentioned how somebody expresses themselves, how they identify. There are two different issues. I'd like to address them separately if we can.
But they're
because
not
I
separate.
agree.
That is
because
my
I,
question. You
well, let
said
me
you were
answer.
going to
But
answer my question.
I am answering your question.
If people are biologically
so if we take
born
away, I'm just going to
physically
keep talking
in
as though you're polite here. So if we take intersex and we take, for
It's
example,
not polite to question
Klinefelders.
people's existence.
We take, for example, intersex, we take Klinefelders, we take genetic anomalies that are very outside of the norm.
Referencing Kleinfeld.
So,
it's a
for
much
example,
more condition.
there are some people, we've talked about this earlier, there are some people who are born without feet. There are some people who are born with webbed hands. There are some people who are born with 12 fingers and toes. But if what we teach in biology class is that human beings have 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 feet, 10 fingers and toes. We don't teach biology. We don't identify biology
human
based on
beings.
certain
Based on a spectrum
based on
of existence.
outsiders. Yeah, we don't. That's not how we teach biology.
So
that's not how
because
that's
I'm
not
an
how doctors.
outsider, then
That's not how doctors treat biology. So let me go to your. So I want to separate what we were talking about there: intersex and a very small percentage versus transgenderism. People who
Okay.
choose to identify who aren't born that way. But because you keep pressuring me on that, let's go to intersex. Let me ask you this: were you among the statistical reality where you had some very distinct primary sex characteristics as intersex? Because the vast majority of people born intersex are not LGBTQAIP activists. They're people who are born with very clearly identifying traits. It's not just right in between. The vast majority have micro penis and large clitoris, and internal testes,
the
and it's
vast
pretty easy to
majority.
identify. So was that the case with you?
yes, I was identified at birth as being intersex.
Okay, but was
But
it
not everyone is, because as I mentioned,
no, was it the case
sometimes-
where you were identified as a female pretty quickly? You had primary sex-defining traits in that of a female?
Well, I was assigned a female because of the choice of the doctor that worked on me, right? But like I was born in between. So for me, like a doctor made a choice that even though I was born in between, even though they knew because of a what's that called? Amniocentesis.
Mm-hmm.
So they knew before I was born that I had XY chromosomes, but because I was born with a vagina, they knew that I was intersex, but because there's a doctor, again, who plays God and makes a decision because it's all what's going to go on the birth certificate, I was
Right.
assigned female at birth.
Okay, so you didn't transition later on in life?
No.
No, okay. So my question again for you is just because the statistics would reflect that the overwhelming majority of people born intersex are not just born directly in between the two. There's a very clear delineation with identifying sexual characteristics with male
No,
and female.
that's so not true. There's
It is
chimerism,
true.
there's no.
It is true. But so moving on from the intersex, if we remove that, I think that what you're saying is correct. I would certainly
Pundit
separate
is
you.
telling someone who is born a certain way that you know more about the science of my existence than I do. That's
I'm not.
That's
The
point
literature
where, like,
is there, and
if we
I-
want to talk about our sides agreeing or being able to have productive conversations, I think that maybe that's a first step in y'all's camp, is like not assuming that you know better than everyone else who've
I
lived a
don't.
certain experience.
I don't. Just
You
like I
know?
don't interrupt.
Well, I'm sorry. You're interrupting my day by questioning my existence and my boss's existence. So I'm not going to apologize for interrupting.
I didn't question your existence. I haven't questioned your existence. And I haven't interrupted you. And I haven't said that I know more than you. Only you have done that in this conversation. So right now we're at a crossroads. We want to continue with this conversation and it to be civil and
I'm
to
just glad
disagree.
this is being televised or whatever, recorded.
As am
I
I.
look forward to watching it after.
So if we remove intersex and very small percentage of outliers, let's say it's the 1.7, I don't agree, but we'll go with that. Now we're addressing the transgender issue, that gender
Okay.
is a spectrum. So
Yes.
why? How many genders are there? Why do we go with that? Because that's very separate from
So
genetic
gender-
anomalies of intersex.
Right. Gender is a societal construct. So,
Okay.
as my boss mentioned, there is a spectrum. So some people identify purely female or purely male. Some people identify in between. You already talked about the different pronouns that are available. And it's based on your something intrinsic that you were born with in your head. So we've proven, for example, that in terms of sexual orientation, that being gay is not a disorder. It's just like a biological reality. It's a human condition, right? And being transgender is the same thing. It's like you're born. There's actually studies that have come out now that transgender brains more closely align with the gender of the brain that they identify with than the brain of how they were
Okay.
born.
Can I address that?
Sure.
I have a question there. So you said, so I want to make sure I'm not misrepresenting your view. You said gender is a societal construct. Those were your words.
It is, yeah.
Okay.
It is.
So if gender is a societal construct, how can there be a male brain and a female brain, as you just described?
Because there are brains that fit like more, if we're thinking about a spectrum, right? Like there's brains that fall here on the spectrum, brains that fall here on the spectrum. Like each brain biologically is different. Like we know this because of genetic variance. And so some people identify more with traits that we categorize as female. And so those brains look more similar to those who...
I'm sorry, but you're taking you said it's a societal construct, and now you're making a biological argument. Is there biologically a male brain and a female brain that are different?
There is biologically a brain that is closer to a binary example of how people who identify as male and present that way. Their brain looks more similar. And so even if they have been born with a body that, based on what we talk about in society, or, phenotypically, like having certain like genitalia or, gonads that we would say are female, their brain still looks more biologically similar, like when doing a brain scan, to someone who identifies as male. Like there are certain types of brain that exist on that spectrum.
Can you see how for me that's not a super clear answer? And I want to make sure that I don't get your presupposition incorrect. There are generally male brains.
I do a lot of
generally
interviews, so I
female.
know that like getting people to repeat the same answer.
No,
over
it's
and
not. None
over
of this
is
will be-
looking for like an outlier that you can then cut and splice into something. But
None of this will be
I'm
edited.
happy to answer another question if you like.
None of this will be edited.
Okay.
None of it. All of this from beginning to end. If this goes up, if this interview, we don't put up an interview that is edited. So I want to make sure that I understand your point of view here. They're generally considered a male brain biologically and there is generally what is considered a female brain biologically.
Right, by how
And-
we
but
as a society
gender-
define male and female, but they're just like
Well,
two
no.
ends
The
of a
biological
spectrum
makeup
types
of a brain
brains.
is not societal. The biological makeup of a
No,
brain
you're
is
right,
biological.
but what I'm saying is
so I
the
want to
brain,
make
right. So what I'm saying, the brain that you call the male brain or the female brain, with what you're
you
saying,
did, not me.
I'm saying is closer to that brain that you are referring to as a male brain.
You referred to it that way. So I want to make sure I'm correct that you believe there is a male brain generally and
I'm
a
not
female
going to
brain
say yes to
generally.
you when I'm explaining my answer, when I'm giving you my answer.
Okay.
My answer is what you are referring to as a male brain is more.
But I didn't. You did. That's why it's important. You brought this up, male brain and female brain. I'm trying to understand what you brought up. I didn't bring up male brain, female
That
brain.
brain, what society is referring to as a male brain, whether that person was born, regardless of their genitalia and their physical presentation to the world, their brains are more similar in certain ways. And that is because there's a spectrum of types of brains. And so there's a brain that's like that, and then there's a brain that's slightly to the right on the spectrum, and then one that's slightly to the right of that. And there's this whole spectrum of types of brains, just as there is a spectrum of types of skin color or facial hair, all these different things that we've talked about, right? And so what we have found is there is actually a correlation between this identity and a brain that looks a certain way. So
Okay.
people aren't making something up. It's like something that intrinsically that they are born feeling and identifying in this way, right?
Feeling and identifying in a way. Okay,
Yeah.
and this is important because the biology and the identification are two very different things. So I'm going to continue along the premise which you originally expressed. There is, I certainly agree with the biology. There is a biologically defined male brain and female brain. They're different. They operate differently. There are different developments and different portions of the brain. They fire differently. They have different levels of neurotransmitters, and they respond to stimuli differently. There is a male brain and a female brain, absolutely.
And
there are
there's
some
a lot in
anomalies.
between.
There are some very acute
There's a
number
lot
of
in between.
outliers in between, but not
Which
much.
is huge.
There is a
The
male
entire world
brain and a
exists on
female brain.
spectrum.
Okay, well, the entire world exists on a spectrum, and then there are limitless genders and limitless brains. How do you determine what's right with the literature? How do you run a scientific study if you're saying there's a limitless number of
If
brain
my
types and a
existence-
limitless number of identification
if my
types? How do you
existence
line
does
that up
not-
as a study?
If myself does not threaten your daily existence, then why do you care?
It does. It does. It doesn't
How?
threaten my
Tell me how.
existence. I believe the restructuring of Western civilization based on, I don't believe gender is fundamentally interchangeable. I don't believe men and women are
So only
interchangeable.
Western civilization is right, is what you're saying? Because they're
That's a different conversation, but yes.
Really?
Yes.
So the whole white supremacist and Western perception of society is what is right.
I don't believe white supremacy is right at all.
Well, Western civilization is arguably founded by the colonization by white people of people of color that existed already.
No, Western
in Native
civilization is not
America
founded
and
on,
all throughout
white
the
supremacy at
Americas.
all. So I believe Western civilization, the civilization that allows people to live freely, the civilization that freed slaves, the civilization that brought you that iPhone technology, paved roads, plumbing. The Romans did that earlier on, but it was very primitive. Yeah, I believe Western civilization is right. And a fundamental role in Western civilization is that of male and female. And I believe that that is very important as it relates to what we teach children, very important as to how we rear children, very important as to how we jail people if we're going to define pronouns, if we're going to define gender identification. I think it's important if we're going to change the entire fabric, the makeup, to identify what it is. So with that, how many genders are there?
You'll have to excuse me that I'm having trouble engaging with someone who feels that Western civilization is the right way, which is founded in these certain principles that I just mentioned,
It's not,
and the
though.
only way. And that America First mentality is actually what's causing the degradation and like our falling of our status in the world is American exceptionalism.
Really?
Or your exceptionalism of your viewpoint. If you really want to say change my mind, your mind is not open to other ways of thinking.
Here's one thing. If you're looking to change somebody's mind, coming in very aggressive and interrupting,
I'm angry. I'm not.
but that's not a good way to
I'm
change somebody's
interrupting
mind.
because you ask me a question and then I try to answer it and then you stop me halfway through and ask me a different question or tell me that I'm not responding to your question. So forgive me if I'm frustrated.
Yeah, well, I'm just trying to get clear answers to
Please.
understand your presupposition. And then you were the one who brought up, for example, male brain, female brain, and said no brains exist in a spectrum. Let me bring this up. This is a very new thing, you know, that modern gender theory.
It's not a
the
new
gender
thing.
non-binary.
I would
Where does
ask
it
you-
stem from?
It doesn't. That's not the question. Again, you're asking
No,
multiple.
I'm asking you because you said it's not a new thing. I'm saying it is
It's
a new
not
thing.
a new thing. If you
Okay,
read
so where does it come
Greek
from?
or Roman mythology, there's
Yeah.
all different types of humans. If you look at Hinduism or certain religions outside of your white, I imagine you're Christian, correct?
Yeah.
Right. Outside of that societal and worldview, there are a lot of different texts that are very, very old that talk about all different types of people.
Yeah.
That talk about trans people, intersex people that used to be referred to as hermaphrodites, which is a phrase that we don't prefer anymore. We find it to be very triggering and offensive because of the
Why?
way that it's been used historically.
Okay, but it
kind
was
of like the N-word,
medically
right?
used,
Kind
right?
of like the N-word, right? Like there's a certain
Well, not
historical
kind of like the N-word.
context.
Wasn't hermaphrodite a medical term?
No, now the medical term is intersex because the medical community understands that certain phrases then are used to marginalize other human beings until people stop
Was it a
using
medical
them.
term?
And so people stop using them.
Was it a medical term?
So medically, there also used to be something called phrenology, which was measuring like the heads of black people and saying that they were like scientifically
Okay.
less than others.
The
So
only reason
science
I
evolves
asked-
all the time.
the
You're
only-
asking if it was a medical term.
Yeah.
There also
It
were
was a-
medical
it was a
terms
medical
like
term.
phrenology
Well,
that
you
are now shown
compared
to
it-
be very racist and bigoted and outdated and
Sure.
marginalizing.
The reason I bring it up-
and things that kind and open-minded humans do not use.
Sure. Well-
that is my response to your question.
Well, the
I'd be
reason I
happy
bring it
to
up is
answer another
because
question.
you brought up hermaphrodite and compared it to the N-word. Was the N-word ever a medical term?
You know, I don't.
And the reason this matters, again, is yesterday's medical term is today's hate speech. Society can't keep up. And that's why definitions matter. That's why gender
So
matters.
it's
That's
so
why
hard for people
biological
to need to
studies
keep
matter.
up. Like it's so hard for those people and not the people who are being marginalized.
Yes. I believe it's
Wow.
important. I believe it's important for both
You know,
people to be in a
I
society
appreciate
that
having
functions.
the conversation. I really do.
Thank you very
I
much.
appreciate
I
it.
appreciate it.
I'm sorry I don't have a box of tissues.
So let me give
for
you real quick.
Please
Simone de Beauvoir in 1949. That's where modern gender theory started. Then it goes to Judith Butler in the 80s and 90s.
Hey there, YouTube viewer. You like Samantha Bee? Of course not, because you've actually made it to this end card. You are a miracle of the internet. I would say subscribe or hit the notification button, but I don't really know what that means on YouTube. You might not get notified anyway, but you can join up at louderwithcrowder.com/mug club. That's mug with this wonderful hand-etched mug, and you get to watch not only clips, but the full 1 hour daily show every single day. That was redundant because I said daily, but every single day, but we're going to keep it anyway because we shoot these end cards a whole lot in one afternoon. We're scraping the bottom of the barrel with this one.